Good afternoon, everyone. And for those in the back, if you want to join, this is a very interesting conversation we're about to have. I want to thank Matt for being here.
It's great to be here.
Cool. All right, so my name is Ben Kirshner. I'm the Chief Transformation Officer for the Commonwealth. And I'm going to give a brief introduction of Matt, and then we're going to jump into some policy topics, very interesting policy topics. So Matt Peralt is the head of artificial intelligence policy at Andreessen Horowitz. Matt brings a wealth of expertise from his roles at A16Z, UNC Chapel Hill, and Meta, advocating for policies that empower startups and ensure U.S. leadership in AI. Today, we'll explore how states like Pennsylvania can shape the future of AI through thoughtful policy, strategic investments, and global capital attraction, all while navigating market signals and fostering innovation. So, Matt, the first question I have is, Andreessen's been advocating for a little tech agenda. Why did you develop this agenda, and what are its key components?
So it's great to be here. I was last year, I think it must have been 2012 or so, for the President Obama's Council on Jobs and Competitiveness. Meta, then Facebook, was a member of the President's Council. Sheryl Sandberg was on it. And I staffed her when she came to Pittsburgh to see some of the great work that you guys are doing in tech and entrepreneurship. It was a really profound and extraordinary trip. It was great to see the administration's investment in the area, and it's wonderful to be back a little bit later and see the continued development of the tech ecosystem here. And I can't wait to hear more from your perspective about what you're doing to generate that and make it happen. So the Little Tech Agenda grew out of a concern that our co-founders Mark Andreessen and Ben Horowitz had about how the AI policy ecosystem was developing. They were seeing debates where people would say, industry is pushing in this direction, or we have a consensus around this issue. And that consensus and that industry reflected the views of primarily large companies. And I don't have issues with large companies. I worked at one of them. When I ran my center at UNC Chapel Hill, we had financial support from many of them. But those companies don't often or necessarily represent the views of smaller companies. And in AI, we saw a direction of travel in AI policy that would have made it, I think, much harder for smaller companies, for companies like that you have in your state here and in this city, to grow and develop. A primary component of those AI policy models were really focused on regulating the development process. So the way that I sort of think about it is like you have two people in a dorm room at Carnegie Mellon, they're building tools, hasn't yet hit the market, no revenue yet. What are the things that they need to do from a regulatory perspective just to get that technology out the door? Historically, in software development, that stage has been relatively unregulated because we want those students, those researchers, those entrepreneurs to develop those technologies, and then when they put them out in the world, there's a lot of regulation that applies. The challenge in AI has been the primary initial focus of the regulatory environment has been on that development process, with things like impact assessments or audit processes, sometimes that would attach to even the smallest companies. And when you're two entrepreneurs in a garage or a dorm room trying to build that technology, it's gonna be very hard for you to get that out the door. It's not as hard for the larger companies. And so in our view, it was gonna make it really challenging for an AI startup ecosystem to grow and flourish.
When we talk about building AI hubs of the future, what are the policy components that are most important in cultivating a thriving AI ecosystem?
Yeah, so I'm actually really interested to hear about your great work in permitting. Like that, we were talking about that before the panel. It seems like that's an essential and really important component of it. A couple others that I'd mention: workforce development, which I think is actually a bipartisan issue, making sure that workers have the skills that they need to succeed in an AI economy. AI literacy, so that people understand how to use the technology, how to use it responsibly. There are some states in the federal government that have looked at options to create federal or state resources that would lower barriers to entry for AI development. So, as I'm sure many of the people in the room know, it's hard to build AI models and to build frontier models, to build those technologies, because there are just natural barriers. You have to have access to data, you have to have access to compute, you have to have access to energy, you have to have access to talent. All of those things are incredibly expensive and challenging. And so there are things that state and federal governments could do to actually provide some of those resources for startups and researchers. And I think those kinds of models are really helpful. It's also important, I think, in our view, that this area is not just entirely deregulated. And that's something that people are often confused about. With our policy position, sometimes the conversations that just represent the polls, the so-called AI doomers and the AI accelerationists, I think neglect to consider that there are ways that you can regulate harmful use of the technology to help protect people, even if you're pushing toward economic development and innovation in ways that are important. And so if you clarify, for instance, that you can't use AI to violate state or federal consumer protection law, or use AI to violate state or federal civil rights law, or state or federal antitrust law, or criminal law, clarifying that and making sure that enforcement agencies are able to take steps to address harmful use when it occurs, I think will create a healthier, stronger AI market. And that's actually one thing, I know you have private sector experience, you might know this in a way that I didn't coming in, but one of the things that was surprising to me about venture capital is the long time horizon for our funds. So our funds are not 1, 2, 3, 4-year life cycles. Consumer-facing tech companies often have 4-year vesting cycles for the equity grants that they give. In venture capital, we expect our funds to pay out typically over roughly a 10-year time horizon. That economic structure, I think, is really important to understanding the kind of regulatory framework that would work from our point of view. So because we have that 10-year long time horizon, it means it's not in our financial incentive to juice the AI market for tomorrow, to have like a great 2026, booming AI markets in 2026, and then a crash in 2027 because people feel that their products are unsafe or they're bad for our society or they're disrupting labor markets in ways that are really problematic. That's not going to result in the kind of vibrant AI ecosystem that is good for us financially and hopefully like good for the country and good for business. And so because of that, we need to ensure that there is some regulation to protect against those harmful use cases.
So AI innovation requires compute power, energy, talent, connectivity. You talked about this earlier. What should state and business leaders be thinking about when it comes to infrastructure investments to support AI innovation and growth?
So I'd love to turn that back to you in a second because I know you're already putting that into practice. I do think this model, like at the federal government, it's called the NAIR, which I always get the acronym wrong because there's something about the double R's, but it's National AI Research Resource, I think. There's a similar model proposed in California called Cal Compute. And so ways for state and federal governments to centralize resources and then figure out how to provide access to startups and researchers, I think is really critical. There are obviously like a range of other things too, making sure that there's energy access. Again, I think like in the long term, making sure that workers have access to training programs and that students have access to strong AI literacy programs, I think is really valuable.
How does it affect the way your firm is allocating capital? So if startups are in a state that's not thinking about AI policy the way you just described, are they saying, hey, we'll fund you, but you have to move to a different state, you have to be in it, or if we're in a state like Pennsylvania, which is very good and AI friendly, does that help in their decision-making process, whether to invest in a company?
Yeah, so I think we are not quite there yet, but we're at the precipice. So there are a range of state laws that were introduced in this past set of state legislative sessions that some of them positive, many of them totally benign, but some of them that we think would be really challenging for startup development. So really insert regulation into that innovation phase of the AI development innovation process in ways that would make it harder, we think, for startups to get off the ground and to compete at the frontier with the already well-established large companies. Colorado has enacted one such law. One law passed that we have concerns about passed the legislature in New York, is on the governor's desk for signature. And then as we speak, there are a whole set of laws in California that are under consideration. And I think if some of those laws pass, it will affect the kind of guidance that we give to our portfolio companies about what the optimal markets are for them to base themselves in ways where they'll have the most ability to compete successfully. I think for me coming into this, I started in this job in November. For me coming into this job, the thing that I think has been clearest and is most daunting is the intensity of the competition, the pace of the innovation, and the challenge that startups face. Like, we want the frontier AI ecosystem to be competitive and diverse, and we're investing with hopes that that will be the case. And it is unbelievably challenging. If you are, again, like the two co-founders of a company in a garage and you're trying to figure out how to compete with a company like Microsoft or a company like Meta. When I left the public policy team at Meta in 2019, there were 600 people on it. Many of the companies in our portfolio, sometimes much to my chagrin, because I would love to talk to heads of policy at our portfolio companies, don't have one. There are companies that don't have a general counsel. One of our portfolio companies had a general counsel, he left, and now their head of policy is playing both roles jointly. Those are companies that are just going to really struggle to navigate a complex regulatory environment. And again, even if you don't take that hurdle, even if that hurdle is not part of the equation, it's already so difficult for them. We actually hear all the time, it's sort of bizarre, we hear all the time, or we think it's bizarre, I guess. We hear all the time when people will try to be reassuring to us, they will say, don't worry, this regulation isn't going to apply to you guys, to your portfolio. It's just going to apply to 3 or 5 companies that are building at the frontier. And we've heard that from prominent jurisdictions, prominent regulators. And I think they mean it in a reassuring way. Like, don't worry, this is for just the large companies. But for us, it's a view of the market that we think is really troubling. We don't want frontier AI to just be driven by a small number of companies. We want it to be an area that large numbers of companies, including very small and at least initially poorly resourced companies, can compete in.
So with states moving at different speeds on AI legislation, what's the balance between encouraging experimentation and creating a regulatory patchwork that could stifle innovation?
Yeah, so I think trying to think of which side of the equation to start on. The patchwork, I think, is going to be really challenging because, again, if you are a smaller company and you're trying to think about how to navigate complicated regulatory hurdles, a patchwork just exacerbates that. There are some companies that can have a policy lead or a lawyer in every state. They can have 50 people throughout the country, or more than that. They can have entire state teams. The companies in our portfolio, I think, they're going to be unable to develop different rules for Pennsylvania versus California versus New York. And so a patchwork, specifically when the patchwork is related to AI development, like the fundamental process of innovation and science, is going to be really challenging. I agree with you about regulatory experimentation. Senator Cruz yesterday released a regulatory sandbox proposal, and sandboxes are ways for companies and regulators to experiment with different regulatory models. I think that's a fantastic thing. When I was an academic, I wrote about the value of sandbox type proposals. For some reason, I have no idea why, it's like on a long list of things that have been politicized for some reason. Right now, Republicans are a little bit more favorable towards sandboxes. Democrats are more skeptical. But I don't think you can implement them in various different ways, some that are more attuned to left-leaning concerns, some that are more attuned to right-leaning concerns, but the general idea is to encourage experimentation. I think that's a really positive thing. In tech in particular, there's not that much legislation, particularly at the federal level, that's passed in the last several years. I think one of the reasons for that is that the stakes are really high. Like if the idea is we have to pass a law and we have to get it right and it has to govern technology, which is rapidly evolving for the next 20 or 30 or 40 years, that's a really high bar. And I think that often makes policymakers freeze and not act. Experimental models, I think, give them a way to test different options. So like, let's create a sandbox and see what kind of products are tested in it. And let's use that to get some understanding of products, to get some transparency about how they function, to look at how our laws map against the kinds of harms and benefits that we're seeing as a result of those products. That is super, super valuable. And so I think if states are adopting those kinds of experimental models, I think that's a positive thing. Our view is that in thinking, the question of what's the right role of the federal government and what's the right role of state governments is incredibly toxic right now. There's a
I was just going to ask you about that. That was my next question. Okay. So let's talk about that.
Well, I'm curious about it from your perspective as well. But this summer, there was a moratorium that was included in the reconciliation package. The name was clearly not focus group tested with state lawmakers. State lawmakers don't like to hear a moratorium on their ability to legislate. And so I think that framing was a really challenging one, and the perception of the moratorium was that it was going to be incredibly broad and frustrate states' ability to take action on issues that are important to states. And I think some of that was not matched by the actual text of the legislation, but some of it I think was was accurate, and I understand those fears. And our view here is that the Constitution provides guidance that's incredibly useful, and so the Constitution gives a role to the federal government and it gives a role to the states. States do not have exactly the same role. State legislatures do not have exactly the same role as Congress, but they have an important role. The federal role is primarily to govern interstate commerce. And so when we think about the creation and development of a national AI market that would create companies in the United States that hopefully can compete globally in AI, which is of strategic and national security importance to our country, that's primarily a congressional role. That is not Congress occupying the field, because states traditionally have the ability to police harmful conduct within their borders. That will be very important in AI. That is not saying federal government acts and states do nothing. And a really good example is that there is criminal law at the federal level and at the state level, but the body of federal criminal law is pretty narrow. And I think if we were to just brainstorm the list of criminal laws that might be at issue in AI, most of them are going to be at the state level. And so when we are thinking about like how can we adapt our criminal laws to take account of harmful, problematic conduct in AI, that's an area where states are really going to lead.
So this is a two-part question. So if you could leave state policymakers with one or two actionable steps to take right now to support AI startups and entrepreneurs, what would they be? And also at the federal level.
I think these centralized compute resource bodies are a really key one. I'm chomping at the bit to transition to you telling us a little bit about what the good work that you guys have done here, because I think some of the work in permitting, for instance, it's really important. Well, actually, should we just pause there? Do you want to talk a little bit about that, and then I can talk about why it's good for startups?
Well, no. Let's answer your federal.
Okay.
Let's answer your federal.
Right,
I'm interviewing you.
So I think the streamlining bureaucratic processes that stand in the way, that are barriers for companies to get what they need. And I'm deliberately being vague there because there are any number of different things that might be what they need. Those improvements are, I think, inherently pro-competitive. It's not just that they're good for industry, it's that they're good for ensuring robust competition and innovation. And that's because small companies are going to be poorly positioned in moving licenses through a licensing process. They're going to be less likely to know the people who can cut the corners and make things move faster. They're less likely to have the people who can just follow up. They're less likely to have the communications teams that can frame what their needs are. And so trying to streamline some of the processes for energy access and all the various different things that startups might need to thrive in AI, I think is a really good step for governments to take.
And what about the state? From the states, if you can wave your magic wand in Pennsylvania?
So I think all those things apply at the state level. I think the thing, there are any number of different investment incentives and things along those lines that I think are really critical. The thing that I'm not sure this is the most important component of it, but the thing that I'm up in the middle of the night worrying about, really the North Star in my thinking now is, what are the policy frameworks that can be responsive to concerns that people have without shutting down competition and that are positive for startups? And so, sometimes in this debate, people will say infinite AI is positive, and then you hear on the other side, any AI will kill us all. And what the approach that I'm trying really hard to take is to take the fears as a given, not to tell people that they shouldn't be scared, but to take them as a given. And then to think about what are the frameworks that we can put in place to address those fears. And I don't think we're in this weird spot where the policy ideas that we've had over the last 5 years, but certainly primarily since the release of ChatGPT, have really focused on one particular approach, which is regulating development. And impact assessments and audits and those kinds of procedural approaches. I just read this great book called Recoding America by Jen Palka, where she has this amazing line, which is paperwork favors the powerful. And a lot of those proposals, the development-oriented proposals, are paperwork-focused proposals. I think if we strip down if we didn't know the debates that had unfolded over the last couple years, and you were saying to me, I'm really concerned that AI is going to harm me. What can we do to protect against those harms? I don't think we would be talking about impact assessments. I don't think you would be saying, I'm going to feel a lot of comfort if you write a report on all the ways that your tools might, in theory, harm me. And instead, we would be thinking, like, how can we make Pennsylvania's consumer protection law work better in a world where there's AI? How can we make Pennsylvania's civil rights law work better in a world where there's AI? And so I don't think that those are the things that are really like necessarily kind of quote unquote key to attracting investment, but I think we have to get that stuff right to ensure a really long run healthy AI market.
All right, you got one question.
But I have so many. Can we talk, well, let's start with, can you tell me about, there's lots of impressive, significant investment activity here in Pennsylvania now, and it seems like that's been accelerating in the last several months. What do you think is key to that acceleration?
So I think there's a bunch of things going on. First, I want to give a shout out to our hometown hero, Secretary Rick Seiger. 3 claps, good, okay. He's done a tremendous job leading our economic development, our DCED organization. He came in, thank you, Farnham. I think Farnham's over here. Thank you for giving him to the administration from CMU. He built an economic development strategy, the first economic development strategy in 20 years. And I think that also just set the framework for our success as an administration. When we first started, the way I explained to the governor with economic development, there's like he's a basketball guy. There's a 5-on-5 game going on, and there's a bench with 5 states on it. So there's like 20 people in the game, 20 states in the game. And I go, Gov, we're in the locker room, right? We were not on the field. And so Secretary Seiger, leading DCD, has done a tremendous job to, as you guys have heard from some of the announcements earlier, I think with the AWS announcement a few months ago, plus the Energy Summit, the $90 billion, the largest economic development deals in Pennsylvania history are happening right now in Pennsylvania, and it's tremendous. Over $110 billion of announced deals, and there's a lot in the pipeline. We heard a lot about permitting on the last panel, and that's really why I'm here. That's why the governor asked me to do this job, to cut the red tape and make it easier for businesses, large or small, to do business in Pennsylvania. So we built the Office of Transformation. And if you don't know about the office, you can just Google OTOPA, and you can find out all the great work we're doing. But essentially, we started with like a toolkit of 3. We didn't really have a toolkit for permitting in Pennsylvania. So the first thing we did is built the service layer. So we hired and took the best of the best from each of our agencies that issue permits and brought them to the governor's office. So a few of my teammates are here today. Michelle from PennDOT, Jesse's our project managers here. So we took people from DEP, PennDOT, Ag, brought them into the governor's office and created this service layer. The second thing we did is we created, in governor's first week in office, he did an executive order to do permit reform in Pennsylvania. So the end result of permit reform was the first in the country money-back guarantee on all permits, licenses, and certifications that the Commonwealth issues across the 22 agencies. So we brought the accountability back. We know that you don't want your money back, you just want your permit because speed is everything, and we don't want to give you your money back. But what we thought some of us thought would backfire, actually what we're hearing from our agency partners is it gives people a scoreboard. They actually know they're doing a good job now. If they don't have to give a refund, that's a win. And I'm proud to say we're coming up on 2 years in November of launching this product, and it's on every one of our websites on pa.gov. The product is called Payback, and in issuing over hundreds of thousands of permits, licenses, and certifications across the Commonwealth, we've given out 5 refunds, which is really, really impressive. It shows that the government, the agencies are really, really moving at the speed of business. And then the third component is we built a fast track product, which one of my colleagues, Jesse, is here who runs, and we built dashboards to give transparency to the system. So now we have service, we have accountability, and we have transparency in our permitting system. And in a lot of these situations, we're the first and only state in the country to offer these types of services. And I think that's also helping bring people and bring business to Pennsylvania because they know we're business friendly, we're open for business, we get it, speed, and we help out every size business. So
why do you think it matters in AI specifically?
So in all different parts of the ecosystem, whether it's a data center or you're a small company just trying to navigate the permitting system, speed matters, time matters. When you're building these tens of billions of dollars of data centers, every day matters, right? If you can get live one day faster, that could be worth hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, depending on how much capital you're investing. But even for the barbershop, if you get your barbershop license, which used to take 8 weeks and now takes same day, you're up and running, you're feeding your family, you're hiring people, you're creating revenue for the state. So speed matters. This administration matters. And Secretary Sagar's done a tremendous job leading us in commerce, but also the other secretaries in our administration, from Secretary Walker in Labor and Industry and Secretary Carroll in PennDOT, Secretary Shirley at DEP. This is a full government approach. Everyone is rowing in the same direction, all led by our governor, who made it a priority in his first week that speed matters, permits matters, we're open for business, and every agency has been rowing in the same direction, and it's tremendous. And I can tell you, the data speaks for itself. By the time our administration's done, it's the most dollars ever in economic history is coming to Pennsylvania under our administration, and we have a lot more to announce coming up.
So you're talking, I mean, I think like the general theme is being responsive to what people and businesses are bringing to you. There's been a lot of thinking, we've seen it like in the National AI Action Plan, certainly lots of stuff in the press, in other states, about how AI can make government more responsive to people and provision of government services. So how is that part of your responsiveness agenda?
Yeah, so you'll hear this a little later, but if you haven't heard it yet, Pennsylvania was the first state to license ChatGPT out of any state government, which is really cool. And I'm on the AI Council for the state. So I've been using ChatGPT for a while, but the use cases are tremendous. And we're looking at so many different interesting use cases. From the way we do reporting, we do a lot of internal reporting, as you can imagine, a lot of manual reporting. So using AI to help automate reports is something that's saving tons and tons of time. We're looking at our regulation to help people navigate, and actually in DCD, if you're going to start a business in Pennsylvania, whether it's a restaurant in Pittsburgh or a restaurant in Harrisburg, there's a different requirement set that you need to navigate through for permitting. And so just using AI to help make your navigation experience within the state that much easier. So everything to do with customer experience, customer service, is a natural one, right? So it's right now you might call to one of our agencies and spend a lot of time on the phone. Well, if we can use AI for customer service to help, not replace people, but use AI on tap, we say at the government, use AI on tap, not on top, and free people up so we can be more responsive to the citizens who might need to call. You know, my daughter's turning 16 and she's getting her license, and if I can just go to PennDOT's website and find out really quickly all the things I need to do for that versus calling in, right? It's going to save me a lot of time. I'm the type of person that don't want to necessarily speak to someone. And then my parents who don't know how to use computers very well, like they'll want to talk to someone. So we'll have people available to help our different citizens with their different needs. So there's lots of different use cases. We meet every month or so, and we look at all the different use cases that are brought to the council to evaluate, does it meet our requirements to go live? Is it within the rights that we have to use it? Obviously honoring privacy, of course, first and foremost. So we have a whole system. There's lots of great use cases, but ultimately the beneficiaries are going to be the citizens of the Commonwealth.
I think it's so inspiring for me to hear the ways in which you're jumping in as opposed to leaning out. And I think we see that with lots of different introductions of technology, that people see the risks, they hear about the risks, and the instinct is to pull back as opposed to jumping in. I mean, in your response, you were talking about you're not just jumping in blindly, like you're trying to deploy the technology responsibly, to understand potential risks, to deploy it in a smart way, but you're jumping in. And I think that's so profound and meaningful. There was a recent Stanford, like in the last couple of weeks, a Stanford study about labor disruption. And the headlines were about how AI is potentially replacing younger post-college entry-level workers. And like the charts are like this, you know, they're kind of like unsettling to see. And the authors of the study are not like anti-AI types. And so they were really like, you know, it's sort of a measured way to approach the issue. And if you just read the headlines, they seem ominous. And I was reading an interview that the journalist Derek Thompson did with the authors of the study today, and it's like toward the bottom of the interview, it finally comes out that actually what they were seeing is that AI usage amongst older employees was higher than AI usage amongst younger employees. And so they actually, like, the finding is not AI is just displacement, but part of the finding, and I think this is probably a little bit simplistic too, but part of the finding is that using the technology enables you to thrive in the workforce. And so part of the conclusion is we need to do a better job of, this goes back to your question about what can we do to support businesses and development in a state, is to ensure that people are using the technology in a responsible way, but also educated about how to use it effectively in the workplace, and that will minimize labor disruptions.
Yeah, and look, people ask, like, other states call us and they ask, how are you doing what you're doing? What should we do? And look, at the end of the day, it starts at the top. It starts with leadership. Governor Shapiro has given us the permission to experiment, right? Obviously with guardrails, but when you have the person at the top, the leader at the top saying, we want to do this, we want to lead the country, we want to make sure our citizens are prepared, our workforce is prepared. I think kudos to him for taking this initiative. Back in 2023, he's been pushing this. So this didn't happen like last week. So I think we're out of time. The zeros just went off. Thank you guys very much for being here. Thank you, Matt, for coming up to do this.
Thanks a lot.